la luz de la luna quiero escribir para ti, abrazando mi guitarra pienso en ti. ¿Cómo explicarle al corazón? Hay cosas que yo no sé, que en la distancia de la vida y en guerra te conociera, estabas tú. Luz de luna, piel de otoño y este octubre tu soñante. Vientos de libertad, tu sonrisa y la esperanza seguiré. Juega con el viento tu cabello, donde nació la flor faltabas tú. Caminaste por el campo, mariposas amarillas, ideales que profetan tus soñares. Luz de luna, piel de otoño y este octubre tu soñar. En tus manos cultivaron las sonrisas, las mujeres y los hombres que se aman, las escuelas para adultos y los niños juguetean. Gracias por tu amor. Luz de luna, piel de otoño y este octubre tu soñar.
Incredibly supportive of musicians, and she came out, we started singing together 5 years ago. She came out to our very first fledgling drive out of the garage, which was a house party in Brooklyn almost 4 years ago now, and she stayed afterwards and she sat with us and she gave us constructive feedback that was really helpful, and so I hope we've lived up to her feedback, and we have 2 things we'd like to do for her. They're Falling All Around Me by Bernice Johnson Reagan, and I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free by Dr. Bill Taylor.
Thank you. the reasons I'm having such a hard time coming to terms with Susan's passing from amongst us is that she was truly a force of nature with a will of steel that held strong against all the slings and fortunes of outrageous fortune. I was fortunate in that I met Susan when we were both in our 20s, at a time in our lives when we were discovering and defining who we were as people and who we wanted to become. Politics and organizing were at the center of our lives and our identities. Susan and I joined forces during the energy crisis politics of the 1970s and then worked arm in arm throughout 10 years and more of the campaign against the Long Island Lighting Company with its punishing electric rates and its Shoreham nuclear plant. Just for the record, Susan was one of the few people who could legitimately claim to have been in on the ground floor of virtually all the diverse local and state energy groups created during that period. She saw the merits of fostering different organizing approaches, whether that was civil disobedience, state regulatory rate interventions, or the municipal socialist approach of public power. Few of us helped give birth to as many of the distinctive efforts that made up the Long Island anti-Shoreham citizen movement and that enabled it to achieve what it did. Many who knew Susan during the 1980s recognized her prodigious organizing ability, her commitment, and her dogged application. Less well understood was that Susan possessed a daunting knowledge and mastery of political organizing theory, but she wore her erudition lightly. In my opinion, it was those deeper understandings that guided her choices in her work. When I met Susan, she opened up to me a world of organizations and thinkers on the left and pushed me to get involved and engage in the ongoing debates among grassroots organizers. She remained my touchstone even when we weren't working directly together on issues. Whenever I was perplexed in my own work, in my union, for example, I would call Susan, knowing that she would always get me back to first principles. When thinking about what to say today, I was struck by how prescient Susan was. So many of the critiques of politics today, echoing throughout the blogosphere, were points that Susan really foretold early on. Seeing that we are in the setting of a religious institution, I started thinking about commandments. Of course, Susan would censure the idea of a man, Moses or anyone else, handing down do's and don'ts from on high. But she might be okay with a distillation of some of her political insights, things she had perceived years ago that are at the center of organizers' concerns today. I felt she'd want me to give voice to this part of her political legacy. 1, the corrupting power of money. Academic journals and news coverage are filled with accounts about how money, whether from campaign contributors or foundations, misshapes political action. Early on, Susan discerned that money in politics brought with it dangers, that money came with visible and invisible strings attached, and that those strings would inevitably move local groups away from grassroots organizing and toward policy positions that were more acceptable to the status quo. Triangulation. This term gained currency when a scandal-plagued Bill Clinton revived his presidency by consciously and conspicuously playing off of principled politicians and advocates on the left in order to position himself as a so-called sensible moderate who could score points with editorial boards and Republicans. And so we got welfare reform. Susan saw this dynamic at work in local and national energy politics and elsewhere, and vociferously identified this as a violation of political principle. She was fully aware that an insider-outsider dynamic structures politics. She understood that compromises were going to be negotiated by those who took up the role of inside dealmakers. But she constantly insisted that this process take place in ways that were more honest and more respectful of the indispensable contributions of the grassroots base. She recognized the value of people with principles working in electoral politics and with elected officials, and supported those who eschewed arrogance and were aware of the traps of the insider game. She disapproved of those who got carried away with the illusions of being admitted into the club and who put me politics before we politics. Susan's dedication to grassroots organizing, the outsider part of the equation, expressed her conviction that the power of a movement for change flows first and foremost, bottom up, from its strength at its base. Transparency. What Susan demanded of any political strategy was this: was anything being hidden from newly energized recruits attracted into activism? Were the means and the ends consistent and out in the open for all to examine and discuss? Did the leaders' rhetoric really reflect what they said in closed-door meetings with politicians or funders? For Susan, pragmatism and its evil twin, opportunism, were a certain way to disillusion budding activists. Celebrity politics. Susan had very little tolerance for groups that seemed to revolve around individual leaders or egos. For her, it was the responsibility of the more experienced people in a group, the leaders, to encourage and support new activists, not to use organizational resources to launch themselves. In her judgment, top-down politics missed the whole point. That's one reason why, even though Susan was involved in more issue efforts than just about anyone I can think of on Long Island, she was rarely quoted in the mainstream press. Think about it. Certainly, she wasn't quoted in proportion to the civic contribution she made. That wasn't by accident. Susan consciously chose to put her efforts into the virtually invisible work of creating the structures and resources to enable others to become educated and equipped as activists. That was a choice she made based on her principles as a grassroots organizer. Finally, it is ironic that both Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are now claiming kinship with the great Chicago organizer Saul Alinsky. It was Susan who brought to my attention a quote from Alinsky, which she embodied and which enabled her to radiate power and excitement about what she did. It is what inspired my 15-year-old son to ask us this summer, "Can I do what Susan Blake does when I grow up? And can I make a living doing it?" Susan burst out in that hearty laugh when I recounted that story to her, but I digress. The powerful quote from Alinsky is this: "There's no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit." It's worth repeating. There's no limit to what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. It takes a great soul to live that, and Susan did. Thank you.
Something special because Susan asked me to read this, and it really, I feel, seeing her now, I feel like I'm really channeling her. Someone said before that Susan is a force of nature and is exactly what I was feeling, and I want to just reiterate that. This is a poem entitled Posthumus, and she asked me to read it. Scatter my ashes in my garden so I can be near my loves, say a few honest words, sing a gentle song, join hands in a circle of flesh. Please tell some stories about me making you laugh. I love to make you laugh. When I've had time to settle and green gathers into buds, Remember, I love blossoms bursting in spring. As the season ripens, remember my persistent passion. And if you come in my garden on an August afternoon, pluck a bright red globe, let juice run down your chin and the seeds stick to your cheek. When I'm dead, I want folks to smile and say, "That's Susan. She sure is some tomato."
With my wife, Virginia, sitting at our living room table last year, I interviewed Susan. This became a poem. Interview with Susan Blake, June 22, 2007. Third grade, Lutheran school's only African American child just enrolled. Betty Blake, Susan's mother, hears on the phone, "We want your daughter to make her comfortable." Susan shepherds Debbie for first days at school. Truly, Betty Blake's daughter. Got a lot of my social conscience from my mother. Betty fixed on Nixon hearings. We shared these. What is Sunday school teaching us? Wicked to tell kids to be afraid of doing wrong thing and telling us we will be found out. At 5, I rejected concept of sin. At 8, left the church. I am interested in all cultures. Later, Jesus, great revolutionary. Luther had guts to nail those theses on door. High school, coordinator for activism, not just politics, but to allow learning in the community, get credit for music, apply knowledge to real life. Almost leading the teachers. They knew we were the smart kids. We were breaking cultural barriers down. Mother hanging with us. University of Rochester, 1971-75. Knew exactly what I wanted. Designs her major, performing arts in education and social change. Lots of spontaneous theater actions that had a message. First year, lived in dormitory. Down the hall, black students. They played music loud. Comes round petition telling them to be quiet. I wouldn't sign. Let them get it out, their rage. Clear moment for me. My proudest moment, Psychology 101. Professor shows film explaining electric shock treatment. I stood up. How can you show this? Back on Long Island, drama and music for Rotary Summer Camp, recreation therapist, Brunswick Hospital, 1975-77. Got people not just playing banjo and games, challenged them, demanded more. Fired for too good a job. Shoreham organizes first anti-nuclear demonstration, beginning full effort activism, everything else second. I made mistakes with relationships, she says at 54. I regret not having focused on finding a partner to have a child with. I was trying desperately to keep Peace Smiths going. Peace Smiths, founded 1972, office later 90 Pennsylvania Avenue, Massapequa, home of near 100-year-old activist Catherine Smith. Catherine loved what I was doing. Coffee house idea sprung from South Shore visit of Pete Seeger's Clearwater. Monthly in Catherine Smith's living room, hearth, old comfortable chairs. 1985 in Margie's basement. Then George Soprani's home. 13 locations. Finally, First United Methodist Church, Amityville. Topical, atypical, folk music, poetry, and whatever coffee house. Definitely a pacifist, she said of herself. 1978 started using term. You have to be what you are, not push against other people. Don't use words like anti-imperialist, but do not let them repress your energy. Stage 4 breast cancer. I'm supposedly in terminal stage. Tumor has eaten away my breast. I've done my own breast mastectomy. Now trick is to downgrade it to stage 3, or maybe live healthily with it. Nothing is really terminal. I'm still able to be a full person. I want Peace Smiths to be a stable organization. I fear I will not live long enough. Susan Blake's life, song for peace and justice and love. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Okay here? Can you hear me? Yeah, I'm filling in for Sonny. I don't really have to tell you about Sonny. This is not about me. This is about Sonny and Susan. But a couple things about his song. It was written actually in 2 stages. First half of the song was written before Susan passed on, and we rushed to get it on our CD that we released in February because Sonny really wanted something about Susan on the CD. He finished it after she passed away, and we started singing as a band. Also, it's called Last Church on the Left, but in his manuscript, he also called it Ode to Susan Blake, but he spelt that O-W-E-D. And I think everybody here is here because we all owed something to Susan Blake. So, here it is. justice we shall sing. And at the last church, let the dove spread its wings. At the last church on the left. Sunny Meadows and Susan Blake.